Canaris, na na na. It is the Spanish counties, Canaris, na na na. Yeah, it's the Spanish counties, and we're going to talk about them because they're quite useful, you should know. Mainly because, well, how to put this? For Britain, the counties are in many ways their presence around the world. Once you have a limited number of capital ships, you can't build new capital ships, and you only have two new post-World War II, World War One capital ships, the Nelson class, which, because they are your only two beautiful Fabergé eggs, you have them as secure as armored as possible, so they aren't fast and really what you'd use for long-range cruising presence missions around the world. Your counties are it. So the counties are presence rather than fighters. Because conversely, at the same time, because you have those huge, great big capital ships and the numbers of them you do have, those are your fighting ships. Which might sound strange when we consider the course of World War II, but if you think about it, if Britain wants to make absolutely sure no German surface raider is going to go anywhere near a convoy, they put one of the capital ships with it. Because if you're a surface raider, it's a very simple decision. Okay. Yes, I'm the Bismarck. Yes, I'm glorious in my own very inefficient, unique way. But I have a choice of attacking convoys which don't have an R class with 15-inch guns, which I will probably beat in a fight, but the odds are I won't beat it quick enough to not get quite a pounding myself. So I'll win, but I'll be damaged to the point at which, A, if the convoy has any extra destroyers or anything approaching a light cruiser, I could well be looking down the very short barrel of a load of torpedoes. Or alternatively, the reaction capital ships will be steaming at full speed straight towards me. Or I could avoid that convoy and go my merry way and wipe out others. Those are the options. Go wipe out the others. It makes life so much easier. And if you go below that, well, Eisenhower Scharnhorst, those two sisters, they have 11-inch guns. They really want to duke it out with a 15-inch battleship? No, they want to keep as far away from a 15-inch gun battleship as they can. That's why they have the speed they do, to try and keep away from those battleships. If the Royal Navy had fast battleships, they'd be in real trouble. Then they actually probably would have been built as battle cruisers, because the only way you could have got speed enough to keep away from the battle line would have been to go for battle cruiser design, rather as they were fast battleships. That is the point. But and if you were a Panzerschiff, one of those interesting heavy cruisers, which the Deutschland class, it would no sooner go into battle and charge a convoy which had an R-class battleship with it, let alone anything else, than it would decide to take on the USS Alaska. Or some 1940 version of the USS Alaska, if it had been built. There is many ways in this world of committing suicide. There is no point in doing that. But for the Spanish, they have a problem. The three dreadnoughts they did build were not exactly big. In fact, if you want to go see the several episodes where I have discussed them in different other videos, especially the 1905 to 1914 Dreadnought series, they are not big. And whilst they started out with 3, they're pretty much down to 2, and that's before we get to the Spanish Civil War, where it gets even more complicated. So, de facto, the Canaris class, they become the big ships of the Spanish Navy. There are only 2 of them, Canaris and Baleares. And they are based on the counter class, but they are the counter class which have been modified with Spanish ideas by Sir Philip Watts, the designer, of course, of Queen Elizabeth class battleships, of, well, several various quite interesting ships, including the Izumo and the Oati for the Japanese Navy, fair amount for the Royal Navy, and of course, Dreadnought and the Lord Nelson class, which were the last class of pre-dreadnoughts for the Royal Navy. There's also something to realise about Watts, and this is one of those lesser-known facts. And I have to admit, when I first learned it, I was sort of going... He was a keen volunteer and commanding officer of the 1st Northumberland Army Artillery Volunteers. So, he was not only a naval man, and in terms of being a constructor, he was an artilleryman. He understood big guns as well as big ships, and he was designing them. And I always think with the Canaris class, because they come in at 10,840 tons in standard. Which means, as you can see from this, they are 440 tons heavier than either the Norfolks or the Kents. Reflect this. For those extra 440 tons, well, they're 33-knot ships rather than 32.5, or 31.25, or whatever speed they're currently deciding. They can also do 8,000 nautical miles at 15 knots, which is fairly decent. Whereas the RN ones are mostly sticking to 10 knots, their cruising speed. They do carry the 8 8-inch guns, but they also have 8 4.7-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 40mm AA guns, 3 20mm AA guns, and 12 21-inch torpedo tubes in triple mounts. That's 4 of them above water. Their belt, well, this is where it starts to get interesting in terms of what you're building. Because the RN ships, they have belts of 4.5 inch, 3.5 inches. These are heavily belted and sort of designed ships. Canaris class is a belt of 2 inches. They have a 4-inch box around their magazines. They have 1 inch on their turrets, 1 inch on the conning tower, and a deck which is between 1.5 and 1 inch thickness. Which honestly means that, to an extent, they are far more lightly armoured than their British counterparts. They really are. And this is how they looked. To be fair, this picture is, I think, a later one. Not 1920s, I think slightly later than 1920s, considering the design and shaping of the various various bridge structures. But it's a good example of what they were built to be and what they were supposed to be. The Canaris class were in many ways Spain's way of trying to stay relevant. They were not to merely be their representatives around the world, as the British counties were. The representative of the Royal Navy, wherever it went, they were to be the Spanish Navy around the world. There again, look at their dreadnoughts. They can't go anywhere really. They will poddle around, but they're not really up there. These are that. They had rearranged boiler rooms, which originally come trunked into a single massive funnel. Originally. After a while, they get sort of modified, and as you can see, this design has two. It gains the change in funnel structure later as engines are remade, and as to an extent the design itself is updated and balanced better. I would argue that this sort of almost looks like a Japanese-style funnel on a British-style ship, which is an interesting juxtaposition, certainly. But it does also put in trunking and all sorts of things which are extra weight and effect generation of power, certainly, when it could be more efficient. As already mentioned, they have eight 8-inch guns, 4 twin packs. They are based on the larger counties. They are certainly designed with that idea in mind. And originally a third ship was projected. It was not ordered, as is unusual, of course, in the ways of the world when naval procurement. Spanish wanted a third, but they weren't going to pay for it. And to be fair, I will say this with hope in my heart, they did actually, at not too dissimilar time, manage to procure 3 Almirante Severa light cruisers. These were armed with 6-inch guns and displaced 7,600 tons standard. Well, 7,595. So, yeah, they're 5 tons off 7,600 tons. They weren't the only cruisers in service at the time. There was also the Canaris Class, and I think the Naval class was still in service for most of this period. Or rather, Navarra. So, the Spanish Navy is a cruiser navy, and the Canaris Class are their big cruisers. They're their only 8-inch cruisers. All the rest are 6-inch guns, and that's fine. They have 6-inch cruisers in service, and they have these 2 8-inch cruisers. So if you were sort of forming them into equal squadrons, I suppose you'd imagine you'd be forming them into 2 groups of 3 light 6-inch light cruisers and a heavy cruiser. It never seems to work out like that, but yeah, that would have been an interesting hunting group if Spain had somehow been part of World War II. Although, thanks to the Spanish Civil War, only one of these is still around by the time World War II happens. And in terms of the other cruisers, well, all of the Almirante Severa class are still in service. But the Blesa de Lenzo was wrecked in 1932, before the Civil War. And Navarra, well, she did survive and served through the Civil War, although she herself had been based on the town class. Navarra starts out as the Reina Victoria Eugenia, which she serves into 1931, then the Republica, 1931 to 36, and then Navarra, 1936 to 56. They're good ships. Spanish Navy has good ships. But again, back to it. Canaris Class are their big ships. Which makes them kind of important when the Civil War happens. They are finishing their sea trials, their final sea trials, when the Nationalists seize them. They're actually fitting out and completed makeshift fire control and secondary armament by the Nationalists. They were built in the Sociedad Española de Construcción in Naval in Ferrol. So they were built in Spain, and this is important because, as I mentioned earlier, they are far heavier inside this place than theoretically Britain itself could build the counties, although theoretically Britain's limited to 10,000 tons and the counties are 10,400. There's a practicality, a caveat within all the design, within all the treaty limitations. They were 194 meters long, 20 meters beam, 6.53 meters draft. They had Yarrow-type boilers for 90,000 horsepower, and they had 4 shafts which were powered by Parsons-type geared turbines. As already mentioned, they could do 33 knots, and had a range of 8,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. They were useful ships if you were planning on fighting a civil war where your plan was to deny use of the sea to one or the other. The fact is, though, the Republicans did not secure these ships. The Republican Navy throughout the Spanish Civil War is something which is very poorly led. If you consider how important to the Nationalists it was to get troops from North Africa into Spain to fight their battles for them, and where that was where the core of their power base of the Nationalists was, you'd have thought securing a navy which could prevent the movement of those troops would have been a priority. But it wasn't. The Spanish Civil War, as most wars, was born as much out of miscalculation as it was out of arrogance and ineptitude. Political miscalculation by both sides. On neither side did the people who started the war end up in the positions they wanted to do. Canaris, well, she has quite an interesting career. She sank 34 ships during the Civil War. She was flagship of the Nationalist Navy. And some of the ships included the Almirante Fernandez, a destroyer during the Battle of Cape Espartal. She also sunk a Soviet merchant vessel, the Kosmol, off Iran. She took part in the Battle of Cape Machiaco, and she damaged the destroyer Jose Luis Diaz, which was forced to take refuge in Gibraltar in 1938. She captured the Republican liner Mar Cantebrico, and that, of course, was later converted itself into a vessel for the Nationalists. Auxiliary cruiser, if I remember correctly, but it doesn't do much in the way of cruising in that role. It does more supporting of other ships from its operations list from memory. In World War II, She was part of the ship sent out by Spain to search for survivors from the German battleship Bismarck. Hence, mentioning Bismarck at the beginning, it seemed appropriate. And she remained in commission, the fleet flagship throughout her career. It was in 1973 she'd entered service, remember. Well, commissioned in 1936, had been launched in 1931, and laid down in 1928. That's quite a long process, 8 years between laying down and commissioning. We'll leave that to one side. They were planning to refit her in 1973, with the aim being to further extend her life. But the US Navy was invited over, did a survey of her condition, and basically informed the Spanish that you must be kidding me. The ship's good, but it's not been swimming in the fountain of youth all these years. It's been going around salt water. There are all sorts of issues going on here. She's decommissioned in 1975, sold for scraps in 1977, and steamed under her own power to the scrapyard. What this picture is. Canaris, her sister, has, well, she sunk in March 1938, so that's how her Spanish Civil War turns out. She took part, along with Canaris and Almirante Severa, which was, of course, of the Almirante Severa class light cruisers, in the Battle of Malaga, including firing shells at those who were attempting to escape the city. That was the road from Malaga to Almeria. Which we know about, thanks to Norman Bethune, a Canadian doctor, who managed to write and take photos and write about his experience, and it got published in the New York Times. The fact is, those ships, that bombardment caused something like 12,000 plus victims. Using warships to shell cities is not something new, sadly, in human history. In fact, it's very old. One of the scary things about being a historian, especially if you're a historian who likes to wander through a lot of history in order to try and understand as best as any human can the evolution and development of these things. Bombardments of cities and the taking of civilian life. Not something which appeared in World War II. Not something which appeared in World War One. Not something which appeared in the age of Nelson and Napoleon. Been around a long, long time. Some parts of the medieval period, they used dead cows and pigs and potentially in one siege human bodies of the besiegers who died. Obviously couldn't find cows or pigs which were rotting enough. Either way, not particularly nice. And that was a early form, of course, of biological warfare. Send a diseased body flying into a town, it'll splatter all over the place and hopefully cause a lot of infections. Well, the splattering of high explosive. In July 1937, Belarus took on six Republican destroyers and two merchant vessels which were near Valencia. The Republican ships managed to escape, but the six destroyers had to fight a very heavy rearguard action for that one. In September 1937, she found four Republican merchant ships, which were escorted by Libertad and Mendes Nunes. Those were two of the cruisers which had actually gone over to the Republican side. What's interesting is that Libertad originally starts out as Principe Alfonso. Becomes Libertad. Then after the war becomes Galicia. Stays in the service. Anyway. In an early proof of concept, perhaps, for what the Royal Navy had already been building along and suspecting. So remember, this is taking place in 1937. It's very late for the Royal Navy to suddenly change its ideas on warship development, especially on cruiser design and construction. The Baleares is absolutely smattered by Libertad, which is a slightly older light cruiser, with hits being received in many critical areas, a fire being caused in the 4.7-inch ammunition storeroom, and although she limps away successfully, this does suggest that the 6-inch cruisers are not able to be quickly knocked out by an 8-inch cruiser, and probably makes the Royal Navy looking at it go, so our gamble might be right. Are we sure? No, of course we're not sure, not until we actually fight a battle, but so far we're looking good. Unfortunately, two of the merchant vessels managed to decide to change course, try and avoid the engagement, and actually ran aground off Cape Churchill, so one was lost, the other was salvaged in turn by the French, so basically both were lost as far as the Republicans were concerned. In March 1938, Baleares, along with Canaris, her sister, and our military surveyor, again, the trio from the Battle of Malaga, took on Libertad and Mendes Nunes again. This time, Libertad and Mendes Nunes were accompanied by 5 destroyers off Cartagena in the Battle of Cape Palos. At about 2:15 a.m. on 6th of March, the cruisers engaged each other in a very ineffective gunnery drill. I mean, it's... The fact that so many people have used the phrase ineffective. And that really doesn't even begin to describe it. I mean, seriously. They are trying to engage at maximum range, maximum maneuverability. And it's kind of like UAD, where you just know you're just going to sit bashing away with your main guns until you eventually run out, and then you're going to have to engage your secondaries. Unfortunately, for the nationalist vessels in this particular fight, the Battle of Cape Palos was not that good for them, because whilst they had 2 heavy cruisers and a light cruiser, which is quite a formidable force, the Republicans had 2 light cruisers and 5 destroyers. And Luis Gonzalez de Ubita was possibly the best naval officer to actually serve in the Republican Navy in the Civil War. I mean, there is an argument for saying that that's not really a high bar, but he certainly does his best, and is one of the few who probably earned the title Admiral decently. Or at least proved himself worthy of it in the battles he commanded. Basically, as the cruisers were dueling, he managed to sneak around 3 of his destroyers. They basically detached from the battle where they'd been escorting the cruisers, which were firing away, and they managed to sneak, come in, and from a mere 3,300 yards, launched 4 torpedoes each. So that's roughly in the water. In accuracy's sakes, I'm reckoning, this is going to sound strange, I'm going to put all the torpedoes that hit down to 1. It's generally credited to Lepanto, although Almirante and Tequera also occasionally tries to take some credit. But here is the point. If you have 3 destroyers, each one is firing 4 torpedoes, and possibly as few as 2 hit, odds are they come from 1. Odds are you fire them in overlapping spreads to an extent, and odds are it's 2 from 1 that are hit. But we'll leave that to one side. Out of the 12, 2, possibly 3. If there's 3, then it might have been a second destroyer that was also hit as well. Torpedoes hit between A and B turrets, and unsurprisingly, when you get hit by that many torpedoes in that close an area, that close to your magazines, and especially when you only have a belt as thick as they do, well, sorry. Canaris is funny. HMS Boreas and HMS Campenfelt, 2 destroyers, of course, rescued some of the survivors, but unfortunately there was a Republican air attack again, preceding some of the experience from World War II here, and this caused the British fatality, causing them to cease the rescue. I have to admit, also in that battle, the Vice Admiral Manuel Vinera Belando was also lost. He was in charge of the nationalist force at the battle, and he was aboard the Balearis. He disappeared along with 765 of her sailors. That's out of a crew of 1,206. There is a monument to the crew in Palma de Mallorca. Palma de Mallorca. And vast town of Hondorado also as well. What overall are the lessons from the Spanish Civil War on this class? Well, one of them's lost. So right now I should start slamming them, shouldn't I? One of them was lost in a battle, which is confused to say the best. Well, to say the least and the best, and sound confused. Under interesting leadership, at a time when honestly both sides knew which way the war was going. It was making the Republicans desperate and risky, and the Nationalists conservative. And when I say conservative, I mean, if you think you're going to win, why risk it all if you think you can win without it? Yes, there is the glory of the motherland, but there's also living to enjoy the glory of the motherland. This does affect, and also how you perceive the actions of others. They are good ships. But they are not heavy cruisers. I'm sorry, but whilst they are classified on the treaty system as heavy cruisers because they're 8-inch guns and their displacement and all these things, if you have a 2-inch thick belt armor, you are not a heavy cruiser. And honestly, their biggest problem the whole time was their ability to actually hit stuff. Their fire control was, throughout the Spanish Civil War, on all sides, universally quite terrible. This was probably a consequence of A, some of the initial early actions where crews were split. B, some of the political infighting in both sides. But also, there's a big factor of C, and that they didn't have good fire control equipment. They really didn't. The versions they did get, they were either poorly maintained, or poorly installed, or not really the best equipment to buy in the first place, chosen for political reasons. Kind of like Imperial Russia and its purchasing of equipment from Germany when they are the #1 potential enemy. So, yeah, this is an interesting scenario. Because if they've been built any slightly bigger, then could the British or anyone have gone to them and said, well, we need to activate the escalator cores because look at this powerful, this ship's almost 11,000 tons standard. Yeah, we need to be able to increase the size of our cruisers to match. And no. You hear it's got 2 inches of armor. Well, hello. Our 6-inch cruisers are going to be able to smatter that, and the Spanish own 6-inch cruisers were able to smatter it. You know, the damage done to Belarus was quite absurd in some respects, and it's especially absurd when you consider the Almirante Cervera class had between 3 and 2 inches, and between 1 and 2 inches of deck armor, and a conning tower which had 6 inches of armor. So you have a fact that the slightly older light cruisers are far more heavily armored than the heavy cruiser. Which is quite a weird thing to think about, really, from Spain's perspective. Because they knew they were building heavy cruisers and they weren't a treaty signatory of the Washington Naval Treaty. And whilst there are limits, because whilst they are technically being built by Vickers, they're being built by Vickers in a subsidiary yard which they run, which is technically owned by the Spanish government. So it's not being built in the UK. So they could have built a far better vessel. Yes, you can talk about their infrastructure limitations, but honestly, let's put it this way: to put decent armor on their ships, and to get them speed and other capabilities they want out of them, would probably have pushed it up to about 11,500 tons, maybe a little bit even higher. But that could have been very useful for them, considering they were only building 2 and what they were building before. The very opposite thing happens to these 2 ships as happens to Nelson and Rodney. Nelson and Rodney, because the Royal Navy's only building 2, are turned into these things which have to be made almost indestructible because they're the only 2 16-inch battleships. So they sacrifice speed, everything to armor. Well, if you'd made this the Canaris Class 4 triple turrets or something like that, then yeah, I could get behind maybe dropping the armor down to so low. But they're not. And the speed? Well, that's great, but what have you got? Extra half a knot? Is that worth only having 2 inches of belt armor? At that point, there's almost a question of why are you having any belt armor? 2 inches is not going to stop a 6-inch gun. 2 inches is probably not going to stop a 4-inch gun at the likely engagement ranges. Definitely not going to stand much of a chance against a 4.7-inch. And in fact, nicest way, I think a tribal class destroyer could probably wreck a Canaris class. Because I'd like to see their 8-inch actually compensate enough to keep up with the maneuverings a tribal could pull off. Let alone, any of the gearings, etc. Any of the ships with 5-inch guns in the US Navy's destroyers, that would have just been absurdly damaging. Okay, yes, we can talk about design and we can talk about the quality and the way you can put the belt in, but if it's still 2 inches of thick armor, there is only so many design tricks you can do, and they don't really do them on the Canaris class. It's literally 2-inch belt. Wonderful. That's half what the British counties have. Less than half, if you consider what the original counties have, with 4.5-inch thick armor that they have running around, and they have pretty much the same around the magazines, etc. That's just... So yeah, they're present ships, they're image ships. They look fast, they look sexy, but they have no substance. And left again with the idea that perhaps the reason they have 2 inches of armor is because the Spanish really can't afford to build something with more armor than 2 inches. They don't have the industrial capacity to do that. If that's the case, they're in a lot of trouble. The Canaris class have potentially a lot to offer us, as it exposed with the Yorks and York and Exeter, etc., in that they are theoretically the heavier county. But they're heavier, and yet they don't. They're extra 400 odd tons, and yet they are a lot less survivable. Canaris against a British county would not be a fight. It would almost be a joke. Yes, they both have 8-inch guns, and yes, they can potentially ruin each other. But the 4-inch secondaries on a British county could potentially ruin a Canaris class. 4.7-inch secondaries on the Canaris class would have to be pretty darn close to be able to do that. And that's before we start considering the fire control issues, which would probably mean actually British county would probably have the advantage the entire way through the fight. It would be able to hit at longer ranges. It would be able to most likely get the first hit, and would then keep on hitting. There might not be much ship left of the Canaris class after it was dialed in. So what's the lesson, really? If you only have 2 ships of a type, and if they're going to be your core, then you have to make sure those ships are worthwhile. And you have to do your best to keep them. Because, again, the Spanish Civil War takes the Spanish Navy down to 1. They also have a dreadnought which is damaged to a level which it cannot really be used afterwards. They are special ships, but they are built more as showpieces than actual practical warships. The fact is, I almost feel embarrassed for the number of battles which these ships managed to survive versus the Republican side, because they are so weak in terms of them being eggshell ships. A 6-inch cruiser you know, goodness gracious me, if the Canaris class comes up against a town class, or a Dido, or a Baltimore, or there's just a list of basically pick any cruiser class, and you pretty much have a good chance of it winning versus the Canaris. Despite on paper the Canaris being a heavy cruiser and being a very heavy cruiser, heavier than their counterpart counties they're based on. It's like the modern supercars, which basically they take everything out. You know, when you've seen extreme sports cars, supercars, which are supposed to be track day cars, and practically much mean you actually can't live on them. They look so good, and they look wonderful in magazines. They produce all these wonderful stats that everyone goes over, and we all sort of look and go, and then you actually live with one. It's like that, you know. They took everything out. They charge you double the price of the regular one. Yes, but the regular one has a sound system and a radio in it, and an actual boot, and all those things which, yeah, they're mundane, but by golly, do they make life a little bit easier to live with. You might actually have a smidgen of legroom in if it has back seats, unless it's, of course, an Aston Martin, in which case I'm to this day surprised by the episode where Richard Hamm managed to fit in the back of an Aston Martin. I personally don't think there is any two-door Aston Martin I could fit in the back of at all. And it's like that with the Canaris class. They are in stats. They look so good on paper. When you're sort of looking at their speed, you're looking at their firepower. Oh, looks so good. They're the fastest. Top trumps, they're the fastest. They're largest. They're this, that. Oh, good. And then you actually sort of get down to the things which make a warship actually be something you want to be in an actual fight, i.e., something you don't mind being in when you're actually fighting a battle. And you're going, so I have half a knot speed, which means I can't get away from a 32-knot ship. I'm not getting away from a 32.5-knot ship. That's the thing. You know, and especially not when you consider in big waves and likely sea conditions, I'm probably not going to be able to make that speed, whereas they're probably going to be able to make the same speed as me. In which case, I'm definitely not getting away. It's just not got anything. And I'm not saying 4.5 inches is a lot of armor. I'm not saying that's going to protect you against anything. Oh, you know, it's not. But it gives you a far stronger starting point for dealing with 6-inch, definitely 4-inch, and even 8-inch to an extent armor than 2 inches. Because, again, you have to think about this when you're thinking about armor. Armor does not make you invulnerable. Armor means that at certain ranges, you are unlikely to get a penetration. Okay? If it's not going to have enough energy to smash through. The range you can smash through 2 inches of armor with an 8-inch gun, or even a 6-inch gun, are far greater than the ranges you can smash through 4.5 inches of armor. And these ships are pretty much, from the get-go, going to be flagships. They're going to be important ships to the Spanish Navy. These are their Nelson and Rodney. Would I have built them slower? I'd certainly been tempted to make them 30-knot ships and use the machinery and space I needed for that to give them more armor. I'd have been certainly tempted to go, right, I can do 8,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Woohoo! All my other cruisers can do 5,000 nautical miles at 15 knots. Well, or 4,000 15 knots. 15 knots is my cruising speed. That's fine. I'm going to keep 15 knots, but do I need to do 8,000 nautical miles at 15 knots? Can I reduce it? Can I take it down to 6,000? Can I again use that redesign to give myself anything else extra? They're good ships, they're still useful ships, but they're not ships which you want to live with if you're actually seriously considering being involved in a war. And we could say it's down to the treaty era and the effects of the treaty, but it's not. Because the Spanish aren't really bound by the treaty, and no one's really taken on too much notice. And it's already 800 tons heavier. 804 than the treaty. 840 tons over the treaty. So, we are now, well, when this comes out, of course, the second part of the York, Exeter, and Canaris class. This is the 6th of April. So next week we have the Leipzig class. Ooh, that's going to be fun. Then the Duquesne class. Then the Sentinel class. Oh, this is a good time. This is a good time to be alive. I'm liking this year of cruises. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And take care, everyone. See you soon. Also, keep an eye out this week because it might be this Friday that I finally in UAD get around to showing you what my version of a cut price county would have looked like and would have been. And I've been thinking about this one for a long while, how to build an efficient county. Because anything's got to be better than York and Exeter. Anything at all.